There exists a peculiar truth about the human condition that few people openly acknowledge. Act of loving oneself stands as one of the most challenging endeavors a person can undertake, not because self-love requires exceptional skills or rare circumstances, but because of an uncomfortable reality that lies at its heart. When you know yourself intimately, when you witness every private moment of weakness, every broken promise made to yourself in the quiet hours before dawn, every compromise of your own values that nobody else sees, the task of maintaining affection for this person becomes extraordinarily complex. This difficulty stems from a profound awareness that the individual staring back at you from the mirror possesses untapped potential that remains deliberately unexercised. Person you know yourself to be could accomplish remarkable things, could push through barriers, rise to challenges with grace and determination. Yet day after day, choice after choice, this same person opts for the comfortable path, the familiar routine, the safe haven of mediocrity. You become the witness to this continuous pattern, repetitive cycle of intention without action, of dreams without follow through, of aspirations that dissolve in the harsh light of morning. The awareness cuts deep because it comes from the one perspective that cannot be fooled or deceived. Other people in your life might see your best moments, your carefully curated public persona, your achievements and successes. They observe the version of you that shows up for work, that maintains social pleasantries, presents a coherent narrative of competence and capability. But you know the full story. You know about the hours wasted, the opportunities ignored, the potential squandered. You carry the complete record of every time you chose comfort over growth, convenience over commitment, immediate gratification over long-term benefit. This creates an unusual dynamic where the question becomes not whether this internal criticism holds validity, it serves any productive purpose. When a person sits in honest assessment of their own life and acknowledges genuine shortcomings, when they recognize patterns of behavior that truly do hold them back from becoming who they could be, the self-directed negativity might feel entirely justified. The critical voice inside speaks what appears to be truth. It identifies real problems, real failures, real inadequacies. The person struggling truly could be doing better, genuinely are making choices that limit their own possibilities. The harsh internal dialogue reflects actual circumstances rather than distorted perception. Yet here lies the crucial question that changes everything. Even if this self-directed criticism proves accurate, even if the assessment of personal failures stands up to objective scrutiny, does it actually help? Does the presence of this harsh internal judge create positive change, or does it simply add another layer of suffering to an already difficult situation? When someone spends their mental energy cataloging their own deficiencies, itemizing their failures, rehearsing their inadequacies, does this process lead to improvement, or does it instead create a paralysis that prevents any forward movement whatsoever? The reality that emerges from careful observation suggests something counterintuitive. The weight of self-criticism, even when deserved, tends to create a state of psychological immobility rather than motivation for change. When a person becomes convinced of their own fundamental inadequacy, when the internal narrative revolves around themes of failure and unworthiness, a strange form of acceptance settles in. Not acceptance in the healthy sense of acknowledging reality and working with it, rather a resignation that says, if this is who you truly are, then perhaps nothing can be done about it. Harsh self-judgment that seems like it should spur change instead becomes a justification for remaining stuck. This dynamic plays out in a particularly insidious way. The person begins with genuine problems that deserve attention and correction. They recognize patterns in their life that create difficulties. They see clearly how their choices lead to undesirable outcomes. All of this represents useful information that could potentially guide positive change. But then something shifts. Recognition of problems transforms into an identity. Instead of seeing themselves as a person who currently engages in problematic behaviors, they begin to see themselves as fundamentally flawed, inherently deficient, irredeemably inadequate. The problems stop being things they do and become who they are. Once this shift occurs, the entire psychological landscape changes. A person who does problematic things can change those behaviors. A person who is problematic at their core cannot change because the problem exists at the level of their basic identity. This subtle but profound difference determines whether someone moves toward growth or remains frozen in self-recrimination. The critical inner voice that started as an attempt at honest self-assessment becomes a barrier to the very changes it claims to desire. Consider the person who spends extensive time inside their own thoughts, turning over their perceived inadequacies, examining their failures from every angle, building elaborate cases against themselves. What happens to this internal dialogue over time? Does it become more balanced, more forgiving, more conducive to positive change? The observable pattern suggests exactly the opposite. The more time spent in this mental space, the more entrenched and extreme the negative self-perception becomes. The thoughts that begin as specific criticisms of particular behaviors gradually expand to encompass broader character judgments. A person who procrastinates on important tasks becomes someone who is fundamentally lazy. A person who struggles with social situations becomes someone who is inherently unlikable. A person who makes poor decisions becomes someone who lacks basic competence. Progressive intensification happens because of how human minds process information. The mind operates as a kind of sorting mechanism, taking ambiguous data and moving it toward clear categories. When faced with multiple possibilities, the mental apparatus works to reduce uncertainty, to arrive at definitive conclusions, to transform maybes into definitive yes or no answers. In the realm of self-perception, this means that mixed evidence about personal worth gets progressively sorted into increasingly extreme categories. Neutral observations become negative interpretations. Negative interpretations become harsh judgments. Harsh judgments become fixed beliefs about fundamental unworthiness. The process resembles what happens when making any decision, even something as mundane as selecting which product to purchase from a shelf of options. Initially, all possibilities remain open. The person stands before numerous choices without clear preference. But the mind cannot comfortably maintain this state of openness. It begins processing, comparing, eliminating options, building cases for and against different alternatives. Within a short period, what began as complete uncertainty transforms into a definite decision. The mind has taken ambiguous input and produced a clear output, moving from possibility to conclusion. This same mechanism operates in self-evaluation. but with far more serious consequences. The person who starts by honestly acknowledging both strengths and weaknesses, who maintains awareness of both achievements and failures, who sees themselves as a complex mixture of admirable and problematic qualities, gradually finds this nuanced view collapsing into simpler, more extreme categories. The mind wants resolution, wants to know definitively whether this person is worthy or unworthy, capable or incapable, valuable or worthless. And in the absence of external input to interrupt this internal process, the conclusions tend to drift toward increasingly negative territory. This drift happens particularly in cases where the person already harbors doubts about their own worth. If the starting point includes uncertainty about personal value, mind's tendency to move toward definitive conclusions typically resolves in the direction of confirming unworthiness rather than discovering worth. Person essentially talks themselves into progressively harsher self-judgments, building elaborate internal arguments that prove their own inadequacy. Each piece of evidence gets interpreted through this increasingly negative lens, confirming and strengthening the harsh verdict. The cruel irony in all of this is that the person engaged in this process often believes they are being honest, realistic-eyed about their own limitations. They think the harsh self-judgment represents an accurate assessment rather than a distorted perception. They imagine that by being sufficiently critical of themselves, they will somehow motivate improvement. The observable outcome typically moves in exactly the opposite direction. The more convinced someone becomes of their fundamental inadequacy, the less capable they become of taking actions that might prove otherwise. This creates a psychological trap that becomes increasingly difficult to escape. The person sees their problems clearly. They recognize their own role in creating difficulties for themselves. They understand that change is necessary. The harsh self-judgment that seems like it should motivate this change instead creates a paralyzing sense of hopelessness. If you are fundamentally flawed, if your inadequacies stem from your basic nature rather than from changeable behaviors, then what hope exists for improvement? The answer that emerges from this frame becomes none. And so the person remains stuck, caught between the recognition that things need to change and the conviction that change is impossible for someone like them. Breaking free from this trap requires understanding something crucial about the nature of self-perception. The harsh critical voice, the catalog of failures, the sense of fundamental unworthiness, all of these mental phenomena are themselves objects of observation rather than the ultimate observer. This distinction matters enormously. Experiencing harsh self-judgment, there is the content of that judgment, the specific accusations and criticisms being leveled. But there is also the awareness of experiencing that judgment, the consciousness that observes these thoughts arising and passing. This observing awareness, this capacity to notice what the mind is doing, exists at a different level than the content being observed. The thoughts about being inadequate are mental events, phenomena that arise in consciousness and can be noticed. But the noticing itself, awareness that observes these thoughts, stands apart from them. This awareness does not itself participate in the self-judgment. It simply sees what is happening without adding additional layers of criticism or defense. Understanding this distinction opens up an entirely different way of relating to difficult internal experiences. Instead of being identical with the harsh, self-critical thoughts, instead of assuming that these thoughts represent the ultimate truth about who you are, you can recognize them as mental events that arise and pass like any other phenomenon. The self-loathing becomes something you notice happening rather than something you are. This subtle shift creates profound possibilities. When trapped in identification with harsh self-judgment, you are the person being judged, and the judgment feels like an accurate description of your fundamental nature. But when you step back into the position of observer, when you notice the self-judgment as a mental phenomenon rather than an ultimate truth, the entire situation changes. You can see a mind that is generating harsh judgments. You can observe the process of self-criticism happening. You are not identical with either the critic or the criticized. You are the awareness that encompasses both. This shift in perspective does not require denying the reality of problems or pretending that everything is fine when it is not. It does not mean abandoning honest self-assessment or refusing to acknowledge genuine difficulties. Rather, it means recognizing that the awareness observing all of this exists at a different level than the content being observed. Thoughts about being inadequate are real thoughts that genuinely arise. The feelings of unworthiness are real feelings that genuinely occur. They are phenomena happening within awareness rather than fundamental truths about the nature of awareness itself. Most people spend the overwhelming majority of their mental lives identified with the contents of consciousness rather than resting in awareness itself. They experience themselves as being their thoughts, their emotions, their self-concepts, their judgments and opinions. This identification creates the sense that harsh self-judgment represents who they truly are rather than mental phenomena they are experiencing. Breaking this identification does not happen through positive thinking or self-affirmation or any attempt to replace negative content with positive content. It happens through a more radical shift, a recognition that you are the space in which all content arises rather than any particular content itself. This recognition can sound abstract or philosophical, but it has immediate practical implications. When you rest in awareness rather than identification with mental content, the harsh self-judgments lose much of their power. They still arise, they still occur as mental phenomena, but they no longer carry the same weight of absolute truth. You can see them happening without being consumed by them. You can acknowledge problems without concluding that you are fundamentally defective. You can recognize failures without building an identity around being a failure. This shift also changes the relationship between self-assessment and behavior change in crucial ways. When identified with harsh self-judgment, any attempt at change carries the burden of trying to prove you are not the terrible person your thoughts say you are. This creates enormous pressure and resistance. The effort to change becomes entangled with existential questions about fundamental worth. Success or failure at specific behaviors takes on outsized significance because it seems to prove or disprove something essential about your basic nature. When you rest in awareness rather than identification with self-judgment, behavior change becomes simpler and more straightforward. Problems can be addressed as problems rather than as evidence of fundamental unworthiness. Failures can be learned from rather than used as ammunition in an internal prosecution. Success does not need to prove you are valuable And failure does not prove you are worthless. Both simply provide information about what works and what does not work, what helps and what hinders, what moves you toward desired outcomes, and what moves you away from them. This more spacious relationship with yourself also changes how you relate to other people and how they can support you. When someone is deeply identified with harsh self, judgment, compliments and reassurances from others typically bounce off or get twisted into further evidence of inadequacy. If someone says something positive, the internal response becomes that they are just being polite, or they do not really know you. They would feel differently if they knew the truth. The harsh self-judgment acts as a filter that transforms even positive input into confirmation of the negative narrative. When you rest in awareness rather than identification with self-judgment, positive feedback from others can actually land. It does not need to prove anything or change some fundamental truth about your worth. It simply represents information about how you are experienced by another person. This information might be accurate or inaccurate, helpful or unhelpful, but it does not carry the weight of having to overturn a deeply entrenched negative identity. Without that impossible burden, it can be received and considered rather than immediately deflected. The question of whether self-appreciation can be learned in isolation or require social connection reveals interesting complexities. The evidence from developmental psychology and attachment research strongly suggests that humans learn patterns of self relating primarily through their early relationships with caregivers who receive consistent, attuned, emotionally available caregiving tend to develop what researchers call secure attachment, a confident expectation that relationships are safe and reliable, and a corresponding sense of being worthy of care and attention. This early relational experience shapes not only how they relate to others, but also how they relate to themselves. In contrast, children who experience inconsistent, neglectful, or abusive caregiving develop insecure attachment patterns. They may become anxiously attached, constantly worried that others will abandon them, and desperately seeking reassurance that never quite resolves their underlying anxiety. They may become avoidantly attached, learning that emotional closeness is dangerous and relationships are unreliable, leading them to maintain distance and self-sufficiency even when connection might be beneficial. These early relational patterns become internalized templates that shape self-perception and self-treatment. The person with secure attachment has internalized a sense that they are worthy of care, that their needs matter, they deserve respect and consideration. This internalized sense shapes how they treat themselves even when alone. They can provide themselves with the same kind of care and compassion they received from early caregivers. They can recognize their own needs as legitimate and take actions to meet those needs. They can comfort themselves in distress rather than compounding suffering with harsh self-criticism. In contrast, the person with insecure attachment has internalized very different messages. If early caregivers were dismissive of their needs, they internalize the sense that their needs do not matter. If early caregivers were harsh and critical, they internalize harsh criticism as the appropriate way to respond to perceived inadequacy. If early caregivers were unpredictable or frightening, they internalize a sense that they cannot trust even themselves to provide safety and stability. These internalized patterns operate automatically, shaping self, perception and self-treatment outside conscious awareness. This developmental reality creates a significant challenge for someone attempting to develop healthier self-relating later in life. Patterns laid down in early childhood run deep and feel like simple reality rather than learned responses. The person who internalized harsh criticism as normal cannot easily recognize it as harsh because they have no other baseline for comparison. What might strike someone else as excessively self-punishing feels to them like appropriate accountability or realistic assessment. Very capacity to recognize and question these patterns requires developing some distance from them, ability to see them as patterns rather than as reality itself. This is where therapeutic relationships can be transformative. A skilled therapist provides consistent, attuned, non-judgmental presence, essentially offering a corrective relational experience. Over time, experiencing this different kind of relationship allows the person to internalize new patterns. They begin to discover that someone can witness their struggles without judgment, can see their mistakes without condemnation, can recognize their pain without trying to fix or minimize it. This experience of being met with compassion rather than criticism gradually creates the possibility of treating themselves with similar compassion. The therapeutic relationship works not primarily through insight or understanding, though these matter, through the actual lived experience of a different kind of relational connection. The person learns through repeated experience that expressing vulnerability does not lead to rejection, that acknowledging mistakes does not result in harsh judgment, that asking for help does not prove weakness. These discoveries happen not at the level of intellectual understanding, but at the level of felt experience, gradually reshaping the internalized working models of relationship that were formed in childhood. This does not mean that developing healthier self-relating requires years of therapy. For some people, this may indeed be the most effective path. The same principles can operate in other relationships. Friendships, mentorships, communities where people experience consistent care and respect. The key element is repeated experience of being treated well, having one's humanity recognized and valued, of being met with compassion in moments of difficulty. Over time, these experiences create new possibilities for how someone relates to themselves. The challenge of developing healthier self relating in isolation stems from the fact that the patterns needing to change were formed in relationship and typically require relationship to fully transform. Sitting alone and trying to think differently about yourself has limited effectiveness because the patterns operate at a deeper level than conscious thought. They show up in immediate emotional reactions, in automatic behavioral responses, in the felt sense of what seems normal and right and true. Changing these deep patterns typically requires the kind of repeated contradictory evidence that comes from actual relational experience rather than from solitary reflection. This does not mean that individual practices have no value. Meditation, journaling, self-reflection, and similar practices can create important shifts in self-awareness and self-relating. They work best when combined with actual relational experiences that provide evidence contradicting old patterns. Person who practices self-compassion in meditation but never experiences compassion from others may struggle to fully believe in the possibility of treating themselves with kindness. Contrast, the person who receives compassion from others and also practices self-compassion in meditation can integrate both sources of evidence, gradually internalizing new patterns more deeply. Specific challenge with harsh self-judgment is that it creates a kind of closed system that resists change. If you deeply believe you are fundamentally flawed, you will tend to interpret all evidence through this belief. Positive feedback gets discounted or explained away. Achievements get attributed to luck or external circumstances rather than to your own capability. Failures get taken as confirmation of your inadequacy. Negative belief acts as a filter that ensures all evidence ultimately supports the predetermined conclusion. Breaking out of this closed system typically requires some external input powerful enough to interrupt the pattern. This is why relationships matter so much for developing healthier self-relating. Other people can provide perspectives you cannot generate for yourself because you are too caught in your own patterns. They can reflect back qualities you cannot see because your self-perception is too distorted. They can offer compassion when your internal critic is too harsh, accountability when your self-judgment becomes an excuse for passivity, encouragement when your discouragement threatens to overwhelm. This external input does not need to be perfect or constant, but it needs to be present enough to interrupt the closed loop of harsh self-judgment. The person attempting to develop healthier self-relating in isolation faces the additional challenge that spending too much time inside their own thoughts tends to intensify rather than resolve difficulties. Without external input to provide alternative perspectives, the mind tends to rehearse the same patterns repeatedly, actually strengthening the neural pathways associated with harsh self-judgment through repetition. The thoughts become more entrenched, more automatic, more difficult to question or resist. Begins as an attempt to understand and resolve the problem of harsh self-judgment can paradoxically make it worse by providing extended time for the pattern to run unchecked. This is not an argument against solitude or self-reflection, both of which have important value. Rather, it is a recognition that for people struggling with harsh self-judgment, extended solitary rumination typically moves things in an unhelpful direction, takes the raw material of genuine problems and progressively turns them into evidence of fundamental unworthiness. Small mistakes become major character flaws. Specific failures become proof of general incompetence. Isolated incidents become indictments of essential identity. The longer this process runs without interruption, the more extreme and totalizing the conclusions become. Breaking this pattern requires different strategies depending on whether the person can access supportive relationships or must work primarily in isolation. For those with access to supportive others, the task involves actually using those connections rather than isolating in shame. This often requires overcoming the tendency to withdraw precisely when connection would be most helpful. Person who feels most unworthy of care and attention often has the hardest time reaching out for support, creating a vicious cycle where isolation intensifies the very problems that make isolation feel necessary. Overcoming this tendency requires recognizing a particular mental trap that maintains isolation even when opportunities for connection exist. This trap involves negotiating against yourself in advance of actual social interaction. Someone invites you to join them for an activity, you immediately construct internal narratives about why they do not really want you there, why they are just being polite, why you would be imposing if you accepted. These narratives operate as if they represent accurate mind reading of the other person's thoughts and intentions. They are actually projections of your own harsh self-judgment onto the other person. The other person issues an invitation because they genuinely want your company. Their words and actions indicate interest in spending time with you. But your internal dialogue rewrites this reality, transforming a sincere invitation into mere politeness, interpreting genuine interest as obligation or pity. This rewriting happens automatically and feels completely convincing because it aligns with your existing negative self-perception. It seems obviously true that they cannot really want you there because you know how inadequate and unworthy you are. The fact that their actual behavior contradicts this assessment gets explained away rather than taken as evidence that the assessment might be wrong. This pattern of negotiating against yourself extends far beyond questions of social invitations. It shows up whenever ambiguous evidence could support either a positive or negative interpretation of how others perceive you. Does not immediately respond to a message. Harsh self-judgment interprets this as rejection or disinterest rather than considering the many other reasons someone might not respond immediately. If a conversation feels slightly awkward, harsh self-judgment takes this as proof that you are unlikable rather than recognizing that many conversations include awkward moments that have nothing to do with anyone being inadequate. The problem with this pattern is that it prevents you from ever gathering evidence that might contradict your negative self-assessment. If you turn down invitations because you have convinced yourself they are insincere, you never discover whether people actually enjoy your company. If you interpret every ambiguous social signal in the most negative possible way, you create a self-fulfilling prophecy where your expectations of rejection lead you to behave in ways that actually do push people away, which then confirms your original belief that you are unwelcome. Breaking this pattern requires a commitment to taking people's words and actions at face value rather than rewriting them through the filter of harsh self-judgment. If someone invites you to something, treat the invitation as genuine unless you have clear evidence otherwise. If someone expresses appreciation or affection, receive it as their actual experience rather than immediately explaining why they must not really mean it or do not know the real you. If someone makes time for you, take this as evidence that they value your presence rather than spinning elaborate theories about obligation or pity. This does not mean becoming naive or ignoring genuine red flags in relationships. Some people truly are dishonest. Invitations truly are made out of obligation rather than genuine desire. Some expressions of care truly mask hidden agendas. The point is not to lose discernment, but to recognize that harsh self-judgment biases you toward negative interpretations, even when positive interpretations fit the evidence equally well or better. The person struggling with feeling unworthy tends to vastly underestimate how positively others might perceive them, systematically discounting evidence of genuine liking or care while taking any hint of rejection or criticism as definitive proof of their unworthiness. This bias requires conscious effort to notice. When you are negotiating against yourself, when you are rewriting other people's behavior to conform to your negative self-assessment rather than taking it at face value. It means catching yourself in the act of constructing elaborate justifications for why someone's positive treatment of you does not count or does not reflect their real feelings. Smiling, it means questioning whether your confident mind reading of other people's negative judgments might be projection rather than perception. It means giving people the opportunity to actually like you instead of preemptively protecting yourself from rejection by ensuring you never find out whether they would actually reject you or not. Person working on developing healthier self, relating primarily in isolation without regular access to supportive relationships. The challenge becomes finding ways to interrupt the closed loop of harsh self-judgment without relying on external input. This is genuinely difficult and requires developing capacities that most people have never cultivated. The most effective approaches involve learning to observe mental processes with some degree of detachment rather than being completely identified with them. This capacity for detached observation develops through contemplative practices like meditation. Not all forms of meditation target this specific capacity equally well. Meditation practices focus primarily on relaxation or stress reduction. Others emphasize concentration and mental discipline. Practices most relevant for developing healthier self-relating are those that cultivate what is sometimes called metacognitive awareness, the ability to observe your own mental processes from a slight distance rather than being completely caught up in them. This metacognitive awareness creates the possibility of noticing harsh self-judgment arising without immediately believing it or identifying with it. You can observe the thought that you are inadequate without concluding that this thought represents objective truth about your fundamental nature. You can notice the feeling of unworthiness without taking it as proof that you actually are unworthy. You can watch the entire process of harsh self-criticism happening without being consumed by it or needing to argue against it or defend yourself from it. This observational stance might sound passive or disengaged, actually represents a radical shift in how you relate to difficult internal experiences. When completely identified with harsh self-judgment, you are the person being judged, and the judgment feels like truth about who you are. Observing harsh self-judgment from metacognitive distance, you see a mental process happening. You are not identical with either the judge or the judged. You are the awareness in which this entire drama plays out, but you are not a character in the drama itself. Developing this capacity requires practice because it goes against the deeply ingrained tendency to be identified with the contents of consciousness. Most people spend their entire lives experiencing themselves as being their thoughts and emotions rather than as awareness of thoughts and emotions. The shift from identification to observation does not happen through intellectual understanding alone. You can know conceptually that you are not your thoughts. This knowing remains abstract until you actually experience the difference directly through practice. The practice itself is simple in principle, though challenging in execution. You sit quietly and observe whatever mental phenomena arise without trying to change them or get rid of them or figure them out. Thoughts arise and you notice them arising. Emotions arise and you notice them arising. Physical sensations arise and you notice them arising. The harsh critical voice speaks and you notice it speaking. The feeling of unworthiness emerges and you notice it emerging. In each case, The key is maintaining awareness of the phenomenon without identifying with it, without assuming it represents truth about who you fundamentally are. This practice sounds easier than it is because the mind's natural tendency is to grab onto whatever arises and either elaborate it or fight against it. If harsh self-judgment arises, the mind wants either to follow that train of thought, building an elaborate case for your inadequacy, to argue against it, trying to prove you are actually adequate. Either response keeps you engaged at the level of content and caught in the drama of defending or attacking yourself. Practice of metacognitive awareness involves neither following nor fighting, but simply observing, maintaining awareness of the mental process without getting pulled into it. Over time, with consistent practice, observational capacity grows stronger. You develop the ability to notice harsh judgment arising without immediately believing it or needing to do anything about it. This does not make the harsh thoughts disappear or transform them into positive thoughts. The critical voice still speaks, the feelings of unworthiness still arise, but they no longer carry the same weight of absolute truth. They become weather patterns moving through the sky of awareness rather than definitive statements about the nature of the sky itself. This shift has profound implications for how you relate to yourself and your life. Problems can be acknowledged without shame because acknowledging problems does not prove you are fundamentally defective. Failures can be learned from without devastation because failing at something does not mean you are a failure as a person. Difficult emotions can be felt without being overwhelmed because feeling inadequate does not mean you are inadequate. Content of experience becomes information rather than identity, phenomena to work with rather than truth about who you are at your core. This more spacious relationship with yourself also changes what becomes possible in terms of behavior change and personal growth. When harsh self-judgment dominates, any attempt to change carries enormous emotional weight. Success would prove you are not as terrible as you fear, while failure would confirm your worst fears about yourself. This makes the stakes of any change attempt feel impossibly high, often leads to paralysis, where it feels safer not to try than to risk failure that would deliver a devastating blow to already fragile self-worth. When you relate to yourself from metacognitive awareness rather than identification with harsh judgment, behavior change becomes much simpler and more straightforward. You can recognize that certain patterns are not working without this meaning you are fundamentally broken. You can try new approaches without success or failure determining your basic worth as a person. You can fail multiple times in the process of learning something new without each failure adding to a cumulative case against yourself. Process of growth becomes actually possible because it no longer requires being perfect from the start or proving anything about your essential nature through your performance. This is particularly important for people who have become trapped in the pattern where harsh self-judgment creates paralysis rather than motivation. When you believe you are fundamentally inadequate, any action risks confirming this belief if the action does not succeed perfectly. This makes inaction feel safer than action, passivity feel more comfortable than engagement, familiar ruts feel less threatening than attempts at change. Harsh judgment that seems like it should motivate improvement instead becomes the primary obstacle to improvement. Breaking free from this trap requires developing a different relationship with both failure and success. Failure needs to become information about what did not work rather than proof of fundamental inadequacy. Success needs to become information about what did work rather than a fragile achievement that temporarily wards off feelings of unworthiness, but could be destroyed by the next failure. Both outcomes need to shed their existential significance and become simply data points in the ongoing process of learning and growth. This shift happens more readily when you can observe your reactions to success and failure from metacognitive distance. When you fail at something and the harsh critical voice starts its familiar litany, you can notice this happening without being consumed by it. You can see the mind generating judgments and interpretations without taking those judgments and interpretations as objective truth. You can acknowledge that something did not work while recognizing that the story about why it did not work might be a mental construction rather than accurate assessment. When you succeed at something and feel a temporary relief from harsh self-judgment, you can notice this pattern too. You can see how success provides temporary respite from the critical voice without fundamentally changing the underlying pattern. You can recognize that your basic sense of worth should not depend on this particular achievement or any achievement. You can appreciate the accomplishment without needing it to prove anything about your fundamental nature. This more balanced perspective allows genuine learning and growth because you are not constantly defending against existential threats to your sense of self. You can acknowledge strengths without them proving you are wonderful and weaknesses, without them proving you are terrible. You can try things and fail without the failure devastating you, and try things and succeed without the success having to compensate for deep feelings of inadequacy. You become free to engage with life as it actually is rather than as a constant referendum on your basic worth as a person. The capacity to rest in metacognitive awareness rather than identification with mental content represents what contemplative traditions have sometimes called abiding in yourself or dwelling in the witnessing presence. These poetic descriptions point to something quite specific. It means learning to recognize yourself as the awareness in which all experience arises rather than as any particular content of experience. The thoughts about being inadequate are experiences arising in awareness. The feelings of unworthiness are experiences arising in awareness. Even the sense of being a separate self with a particular identity is an experience arising in awareness. From this perspective, the question of whether this awareness itself includes harsh self-judgment becomes crucial. When you rest in pure awareness rather than identification with mental content, does harsh self-judgment exist at that level? The answer, according to contemplative traditions and confirmed by the direct experience of practitioners, is no. Witnessing awareness itself does not judge, does not criticize, does not reject any experience as wrong or bad. It simply allows all experience to arise and pass without resistance or grasping. This does not mean the witnessing awareness is blank or empty in some nihilistic sense. It is simply free from the valued evaluative overlay that normally accompanies experience. Harsh self-judgment is part of the evaluative overlay, part of the mental commentary that arises in response to experience rather than part of awareness itself. When you learn to rest in awareness rather than in the commentary, harsh self-judgment can still arise as a mental phenomenon, but it no longer determines your basic sense of who you are because you are not identified with it. Learning to access and stabilize in this witnessing awareness represents advanced contemplative practice that typically requires extended training. It is not something most people can achieve quickly or easily through a few meditation sessions. The instruction to simply rest in awareness sounds straightforward, but proves quite challenging to implement because the mind's habitual tendency to identify with content is so strong. Every time you think you have rested in pure awareness, you have probably actually identified with a subtle mental concept of what pure awareness should feel like. This is why contemplative traditions emphasize the importance of sustained practice under the guidance of experienced teachers. The subtleties involved in distinguishing between actually resting in awareness and thinking about resting in awareness require repeated exposure and correction. Easily tricks itself into believing it has achieved understanding when it has actually just created new forms of mental content to identify with. Navigating these pitfalls requires both individual practice and external guidance from those who have traversed the territory before. For someone working primarily in isolation without access to experienced teachers or supportive community, developing this capacity becomes even more challenging. The obstacles and pitfalls are numerous, and without external feedback, it becomes difficult to distinguish genuine progress from subtle forms of self-deception. This does not mean the project is impossible, but it does mean it requires exceptional dedication, honest self-assessment, and willingness to persist through long periods where progress may not be apparent. The alternative approach, working with supportive relationships to gradually internalize healthier patterns of self-relating, typically proves more accessible for most people. This does not require finding perfect relationships or waiting until you have a full support system in place. It means taking whatever opportunities for genuine connection exist and actually using them rather than isolating in shame. It means practicing the opposite of negotiating against yourself, giving people the chance to actually like you instead of preemptively deciding they cannot or do not. This might begin with small steps, accepting an invitation you would normally decline, sharing something vulnerable with someone who has shown themselves trustworthy, asking for help when you need it instead of suffering alone. Each of these actions provides an opportunity for the experience of being met with care rather than judgment, having your humanity recognized rather than rejected. Over time, accumulating these experiences creates new possibilities for how you relate to yourself because you have internalized evidence that contradicts the harsh narrative of unworthiness. The key is recognizing that other people truly cannot read your mind and do not have direct access to your internal experience of yourself. They perceive you based on how you show up in interaction with them. This perception may be more accurate in some ways and less accurate in others compared to your own self-perception. It is real and valid as their actual experience. When someone says they enjoy your company, they are reporting their actual experience. Someone expresses appreciation for something you did, they are describing their genuine response. When someone seeks you out or makes time for you, continue deck 12 are demonstrating through action that they value the connection. These perceptions and responses from others represent real data about how you impact the world and the people in it. This data often contradicts the harsh internal narrative that says you are fundamentally unlikable, unworthy, or inadequate. Tendency when receiving this contradictory evidence is to explain it away, to find reasons why it does not count, maintain the coherence of the negative self-assessment, even in the face of disconfirming evidence. Resisting this tendency requires consciously choosing to take people's responses to you at face value rather than filtering everything through the lens of harsh self-judgment. This practice of receiving positive feedback without immediately explaining it away or discounting it creates gradual shifts in self-perception. The shifts typically happen slowly and unevenly rather than in sudden transformative moments. You might notice that an interaction you would have previously interpreted as evidence of your inadequacy no longer carries that charge. You might find yourself accepting an invitation without the usual elaborate internal debate about whether you are actually wanted. Catch yourself starting to negotiate against yourself and consciously choose a different response. These small shifts accumulate over time into larger patterns of change. The combination of external relational experiences that provide contradictory evidence to harsh self-judgment, in turn, and internal contemplative practices that develop metacognitive awareness represents the most robust approach to developing healthier self-relating. The external relationships provide the raw material of positive experiences to internalize, while the internal practices provide the capacity to observe and gradually identify from harsh mental patterns. Together, these approaches work synergistically in ways that either approach alone cannot quite achieve. Yet even with both approaches working together, the process rarely unfolds smoothly or linearly. There will be periods of apparent progress followed by periods where old patterns reassert themselves with full force. There will be moments of genuine insight and freedom followed by forgetting and falling back into identification with harsh judgment. There will be relationships that provide genuine support and relationships that reinforce old patterns of unworthiness. The path toward healthier self relating typically wins and loops rather than proceeding straight ahead. This reality requires patience and compassion with yourself during the process, which itself represents a challenge when harsh self-judgment remains present. The tendency is to judge yourself harshly for not progressing fast enough, for falling back into old patterns, still struggling with issues you think you should have resolved by now. This secondary layer of harsh judgment about having harsh judgment creates additional suffering and actually slows the process of change because it reinforces the underlying pattern of harsh self, relating even while ostensibly trying to overcome it. Breaking this cycle requires recognizing that change of deeply ingrained psychological patterns typically happens slowly and unevenly. There is no shortcut through the process, no way to force faster progress through sheer willpower or determination. Patterns that need to change were formed over years or decades through repeated experiences. Changing them also requires repeated experiences and consistent practice over extended time. Impatience with this reality does not speed the process. It only adds frustration and self-judgment to the mix. This is where the concept of self-compassion becomes relevant, though the term itself often creates confusion. Compassion does not mean letting yourself off the hook for genuine problems or lowering standards or making excuses for behaviors that need to change. It means treating yourself with the same basic kindness and understanding you would offer to someone else struggling with similar difficulties. It means recognizing that struggling is part of the human condition rather than evidence of your unique inadequacy. It means acknowledging pain and difficulty without adding harsh judgment on top of the difficulty. Many people find self-compassion difficult to practice because it feels undeserved or indulgent. If you believe your suffering stems from your own failings, it can feel wrong to offer yourself compassion, as if doing so excuses the behaviors that created the suffering. This confusion stems from conflating compassion with permissiveness. True self-compassion actually supports change better than harsh self-judgment because it creates safety to acknowledge problems honestly without the shame that drives defensive reactions. When harsh self-judgment dominates, acknowledging mistakes or problems fully feels dangerous, but doing so opens the floodgates to devastating self-criticism. This makes people defensive and reluctant to look honestly at their own role in creating difficulties. The harsh judgment that seems like it should motivate change actually prevents the honest self-assessment that genuine change requires. In contrast, when you can acknowledge problems from a stance of self-compassion, when you can recognize that struggling is understandable rather than shameful, you become more willing to look clearly at what needs to change because doing so no longer threatens your basic sense of worth. This does not mean self-compassion feels natural or easy, especially for people who have spent years or decades relating to themselves with harsh judgment. Neural pathways of harsh self-criticism run deep and activate automatically. Developing alternative patterns of self-compassion requires conscious, repeated practice, often feeling forced or artificial at first. You might need to consciously remind yourself to respond with kindness in situations where harsh judgment arises automatically. You might need to actively counter critical thoughts with more compassionate perspectives, even when the compassionate perspective does not feel true yet. This practice of consciously cultivating self-compassion resembles learning any new skill. Initially, it requires deliberate effort and feels awkward. The old habitual patterns arise automatically, while the new patterns require conscious intention. But with repeated practice, the new patterns gradually become more automatic. The self-compassionate response starts to arise more readily, requiring less conscious effort. Eventually, it can become a genuine alternative to harsh self-judgment rather than just an artificial overlay. Covering the harsh judgment underneath, the process of developing healthier self-relating, whether through relationships, contemplative practice, consciously cultivating self-compassion, or ideally some combination of all three, ultimately aims at freeing you from the tyranny of harsh self-judgment. This freedom does not mean never having critical thoughts about yourself or never recognizing genuine problems that need addressing. It means these thoughts and recognitions no longer dominate your internal landscape or determine your basic sense of worth. It means you can acknowledge both strengths and weaknesses without either proving you are wonderful or terrible. It means you can fail without devastation and succeed without it compensating for deep inadequacy. This freedom creates space for genuine engagement with life. When you are not constantly defending against threats to your basic worth, when you are not perpetually proving or disproving your fundamental adequacy, enormous amounts of mental and emotional energy become available for other purposes. You can pursue goals because they genuinely matter to you rather than because success would temporarily quiet the harsh critical voice. You can form relationships based on genuine connection rather than desperate need for validation. You can take risks and explore new territory without every outcome serving as a referendum on your basic worth. This shift in how you relate to yourself also transforms how you relate to your actual circumstances and the real problems that exist in your life. Harsh self-judgment dominates. Problems become evidence of your inadequacy, creating shame and paralysis. When you relate to yourself with greater compassion and from metacognitive awareness, problems become simply problems, difficulties to address rather than proof of your defectiveness. This shift from shame to practical problem solving makes it far more likely that you will actually address issues effectively rather than remaining stuck in self-recrimination. The person who sees themselves as fundamentally inadequate tends to approach problems from a position of already being defeated. Why try to change when change seems impossible for someone as fundamentally flawed as you believe yourself to be? Why risk failure when failure would confirm your worst fears about yourself? Why reach for something better when you do not deserve better? These questions arising from harsh self-judgment create paralysis and resignation. They prevent the very efforts that might lead to improvement. In contrast, person who has developed healthier self-relating approaches problems from a position of basic okayness. You can acknowledge having problems without this meaning you are a problem. You can recognize needing to change certain patterns without this meaning you are fundamentally defective. You can fail at attempts to improve without the failure devastating your sense of self. This basic okayness creates the psychological safety necessary for genuine growth because you no longer need to be perfect to be acceptable. You can be a work in progress, a person with both strengths and weaknesses, someone who sometimes succeeds and sometimes fails. This entire messy reality becomes tolerable rather than shameful. This tolerance for your own imperfect humanity represents perhaps the deepest shift involved in moving from harsh self-judgment to healthier self-relating. It means accepting that you, like every other human being, are limited, flawed, capable of both good and harm, times wise and sometimes foolish, sometimes strong and sometimes weak. It means recognizing that this fundamental human imperfection does not make you defective or unworthy. It makes you human. The standards of perfection that harsh self-judgment applies are literally impossible to meet because they require being something other than human. Relaxing these impossible standards does not mean abandoning all standards or accepting obviously problematic patterns as acceptable. It means distinguishing between appropriate standards that recognize your humanity and impossible standards that demand superhuman perfection. It means holding yourself accountable for genuine harms while recognizing that making mistakes is part of the learning process rather than proof of unworthiness. It means striving for growth and improvement while accepting that growth happens gradually and unevenly rather than through sudden transformation. This more balanced and realistic relationship with yourself creates the foundation for sustainable change. Change efforts are driven by harsh self-judgment and shame. They tend to be extreme, rigid, and unsustainable. Person tries to completely transform overnight, maintains unrealistic standards temporarily through sheer willpower, then collapses back into old patterns when willpower inevitably fails. This cycle of extreme effort followed by collapse reinforces the sense of being fundamentally unable to change, making future change attempts even more difficult. In contrast, when change efforts emerge from healthier self-relating, they tend to be more moderate, flexible, and sustainable. You can aim for improvement while accepting that improvement happens incrementally. You can maintain effort over time without requiring perfection at every moment. You can learn from setbacks rather than being derailed by them. The entire process becomes more workable because it accounts for your actual human limitations rather than demanding that you transcend those limitations through force of will. This sustainable approach to change requires recognizing the difference between self-care and self-indulgence, between genuine compassion and mere appeasement. The distinction matters enormously, but can be subtle and easily confused. Indulgence and appeasement involve giving yourself whatever feels good in the moment without regard for longer-term consequences. True self-care and compassion involve treating yourself with kindness while also doing what genuinely serves your well-being, even when this requires short-term discomfort. The parent who truly loves their child does not give the child everything they want in every moment. Loving the child means setting boundaries, requiring effort, insisting on things the child finds difficult or unpleasant. This is not cruelty or lack of love. It is genuine care for the child's development and well-being. Similarly, genuinely caring for yourself does not mean indulging every impulse or avoiding all discomfort. Sometimes it means pushing yourself to do difficult things, maintaining boundaries with yourself, requiring effort even when you do not feel like it. The challenge is that harsh self-judgment often masquerades as this kind of tough love, claiming to be the voice pushing you toward necessary growth and improvement. True self-compassion and harsh self-judgment produce very different internal experiences and lead to very different outcomes. Harsh self-judgment feels attacking, shaming, contemptuous. It questions your basic worth and competence, predicts failure, and highlights inadequacy. The emotional tone is one of hostility directed at yourself. True self-compassion, even when pushing you toward difficult growth, feels supportive and encouraging. It acknowledges difficulty while expressing confidence in your ability to handle it. It recognizes your worth even while calling you to do better. The emotional tone is one of kindness and care, more like a supportive coach or loving parent than a harsh critic or attacking enemy. The same message, you need to do this difficult thing, carries completely different meaning and has completely different effects depending on whether it arises from compassionate concern or harsh judgment. Learning to distinguish these different internal voices and consciously cultivating the compassionate voice over the harsh one represents important work for anyone struggling with self-judgment. This work requires careful attention to the emotional tone and underlying message of different internal voices. The harsh critical voice often presents itself as the voice of truth and realism, claiming that only harsh judgment will motivate necessary change. Examining the actual results of harsh self-judgment typically reveals that it creates paralysis and suffering rather than sustainable change. The compassionate voice, in contrast, feels gentler, but often proves more effective at actually motivating change because it creates safety to acknowledge problems honestly and take risks on new approaches. You know that failing will not result in devastating self-attack. You become more willing to try difficult things. When you trust that you will treat yourself with kindness regardless of outcomes, you become more willing to take risks. This psychological safety, far from making you complacent, actually enables the kind of courageous engagement with challenges that genuine growth requires. This entire journey toward healthier self relating ultimately aims at transcending the need for any particular relationship with yourself, whether harsh or kind. Deepest freedom comes not from having the right thoughts about yourself, but from recognizing that you are not ultimately defined by any thoughts about yourself. The thoughts arise, the self-judgments occur, but they are phenomena passing through awareness rather than truth about what awareness is. This recognition, when fully embodied rather than merely understood intellectually, dissolves the entire problem of self-judgment by revealing the constructed nature of the self that was being judged. This philosophical or spiritual dimension of the work goes beyond psychology into questions of fundamental identity and the nature of consciousness itself. Most contemplative traditions, whether Eastern or Western, whether religious or secular, ultimately point towards some version of this recognition that you are not the limited, constructed sense of self that harsh judgment targets. You are the awareness in which that sense of self appears, the space in which all experience arises and passes. This awareness itself is not judged and cannot be judged because it is not an object that can be evaluated. It is the subject, the witness, the consciousness itself. Accessing this level of understanding requires moving beyond conceptual knowledge into direct experience. You can understand intellectually that you are awareness rather than the contents of awareness, but this understanding remains abstract until experienced directly through contemplative practice. The direct recognition that you are not your thoughts, not your emotions, not yourself, concept, not any object of consciousness, but rather consciousness itself, represents a profound shift that cannot be adequately captured in words. It must be experienced to be understood. This recognition does not eliminate all psychological difficulties or make harsh self-judgment disappear forever. Old patterns can still arise as conditioned mental habits, even after profound insights into the nature of consciousness. The relationship to these patterns fundamentally changes. They no longer carry the weight of ultimate truth. They are recognized as mental weather, phenomena passing through the sky of awareness, temporary conditions rather than permanent truths about what you are. From this perspective, the entire question of self, love versus loathing, reveals itself as operating at a level that can be transcended altogether. Both love and self-loathing assume a relationship between yourself and yourself, a subject-object duality that contemplative practice aims to dissolve. When you recognize yourself as awareness itself rather than as an object to be loved or loathed, the entire framework of self-judgment becomes irrelevant. There is simply awareness and phenomena arising in awareness without the constructed drama of one aspect of yourself judging another. This represents an advanced level of practice that most people will never reach, and certainly not quickly or easily. Pointing toward this possibility matters even for people working at more basic levels of developing healthier self. Relating because it reveals that the entire structure of harsh self-judgment rests on a constructed sense of self. It is not ultimately real or solid. Even without fully transcending self-identification, recognizing its constructed nature can create useful distance from harsh judgment and open space for different ways of relating to yourself. The practical implication for daily life is that you have choices about how to relate to internal experiences like harsh self-judgment. You can identify with the harsh thoughts and take them as truth about who you are. You can fight against them and try to replace them with positive thoughts. Or you can observe them arising and passing without being consumed by them or needing to do anything about them. This third option, maintaining awareness of harsh judgment without identification with it, provides a middle path between being controlled by harsh judgment and engaging in exhausting battles against it. This observational stance becomes more accessible through regular meditation practice. Even without formal practice, you can develop the capacity to notice your thoughts and emotions with some degree of detachment. The key is remembering that thoughts and emotions are mental events rather than facts, phenomena you are experiencing rather than truths about who you are. The harsh critical voice is just a voice, a pattern of thinking, ultimate truth about your worth or nature. This recognition alone, even without fully transcending identification with thoughts, creates some breathing room around harsh self-judgment. All of these various approaches to working with harsh self-judgment and developing healthier self, relating, building supportive relationships, to cultivating self-compassion, to developing metacognitive awareness, to recognizing the constructed nature of the self, aim ultimately at the same goal of freeing you from the tyranny of harsh self-criticism. Different approaches will resonate more strongly with different people depending on temperament, life circumstances, resources are available. The person with access to supportive relationships should use them. The person drawn to contemplative practice should practice. The person who finds self-compassion techniques helpful should use them. Most likely, combination of multiple approaches will prove most effective. What matters most is recognizing that the current pattern of harsh self-judgment, even if it feels justified, is not helping you and does not represent your only option. The harsh critical voice claims to be necessary for accountability and improvement. Examining actual results reveals that it typically creates suffering and paralysis rather than growth. You can acknowledge genuine problems and work toward change without the overlay of harsh judgment and shame. You can hold yourself to appropriate standards without demanding impossible perfection. You can recognize limitations and mistakes without concluding that you are fundamentally defective. This shift from harsh self-judgment to healthier self-relating represents perhaps the most important psychological work many people can undertake. It affects every area of life, from relationships to work to physical health to overall sense of well-being. The person trapped in harsh self-judgment lives in a hostile internal environment, constantly under attack from their own mind, perpetually falling short of impossible standards, chronically feeling inadequate and unworthy. This creates enormous suffering and dramatically limits what becomes possible. In contrast, person who has developed healthier self-relating inhabits a much more welcoming internal environment. Mistakes become learning opportunities rather than proof of unworthiness. Challenges become interesting rather than threatening. Imperfection becomes acceptable rather than shameful. This shift does not eliminate all difficulties or create perfect circumstances. It removes an enormous source of unnecessary suffering and frees up vast amounts of energy for constructive engagement with life. The journey toward this shift rarely follows a straight path and typically requires far more time and effort than people expect at the outset. There will be setbacks and periods of discouragement. Old patterns will reassert themselves repeatedly. Progress will often feel frustratingly slow and uncertain. All of this is normal and expected rather than evidence that something is wrong or that the effort is not working. Deep psychological change happens gradually through repeated practice over extended time, not through sudden insights or quick fixes. Sustains people through this gradual process is developing some taste of what becomes possible when harsh self-judgment loosens its grip. Moments of genuine self-acceptance, experiences of treating yourself with real kindness, glimpses of the freedom that comes from not identifying with every harsh thought. These serve as encouragement to continue the work even when progress feels uncertain. Each small shift in the direction of healthier self-relating creates positive reinforcement for continuing the journey. Ultimately, the question is not whether you deserve love or can achieve perfect self-acceptance or will ever completely transcend harsh self-judgment. The question is whether you are willing to experiment with treating yourself differently, practice relating to yourself with greater kindness and less harsh criticism, develop some distance from the harsh internal voice rather than assuming it speaks absolute truth. This willingness to experiment, practice, to keep working even when progress feels slow, represents the foundation from which genuine change emerges over time. The transformation happens not through dramatic breakthroughs, but through the accumulation of small shifts repeated consistently until new patterns gradually replace old ones and a more hospitable internal environment slowly takes shape.